up the skies. It's hard to believe this now, but there was a time when even American pilots didn't want to fly. The P-47 Thunderbolt. It was huge, heavy, ugly. German pilots joked that it looked like a milk jug with wings. They laughed, called it a flying brick, said it was too slow, too clumsy, too late to matter. But what if I told you, those same pilots who mocked it, they would end up running from it? Because hidden behind the size was something no one expected. A roar so loud it could shake the ground. A dive so fast it could tear through the sky. And 8.50 caliber machine guns that didn't just hit targets, they shredded them. This is the true story of a plane that was supposed to be a failure, but became the reason the Luftwaffe lost control of the skies. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why the P-47 Thunderbolt didn't just survive the war, it owned it. Before the Thunderbolt made anyone nervous, there was only one name in the sky, the Luftwaffe. From 1939 to 1942, the German Air Force wasn't just winning, it was dominating. Their fighters, the Bf-109 and the Fw-190, were fast, agile, and deadly. They could climb quicker, dive sharper, and outturn almost anything. They weren't just built for war, they were built to win it, and the men flying them, many were already aces before America had even joined the fight. They had experience, they had training, and they had complete control of the skies over Europe. Every time they went up, they expected to come back with kills. Now imagine being a young American pilot seeing one of those planes for the first time. You're flying something slower, heavier, less armed, and way out of your element. That's what it felt like in the early days. The Luftwaffe were the hunters. And the Allies, mostly the hunted. When US fighters showed up, German pilots barely blinked. They'd seen them before, the P-40s, the P-39s, and they weren't worried. To them, those planes were underpowered, too soft, too slow. It was like showing up to a knife fight with a spoon. American planes were falling. Bombers were getting torn to pieces, and the Luftwaffe felt unstoppable at that time. The war in the sky had one clear winner, and it wasn't the Allies. By 1942, the skies over Europe were chaos. The Luftwaffe still had control. American bombers were being torn apart, and fighter pilots, even the brave ones, were flying missions they weren't sure they'd come back from. The US needed something different, something stronger, something that wouldn't just match the Germans, but overwhelm them. So Republic Aviation rolled out a new fighter. They called it the P-47 Thunderbolt, and the reaction wasn't great. Pilots took one look and thought, this is what's supposed to save us. It was massive, the biggest single-engine fighter anyone had ever seen. It stood taller than most pilots, the nose was huge, and it looked awkward, like it had eaten the plane it was supposed to be. Fighter planes were supposed to be small, fast, and nimble. This one looked like it needed its own hangar, just to turn around. Some pilots joked that it would need to runways just to get off the ground. Others said it looked like someone had accidentally built a bomber and forgot to add the second engine. Even the name Thunderbolt felt like a stretch, because at first, it didn't thunder, it struggled. Early test pilots complained that it was sluggish on takeoff, hard to turn, slow to climb. Not exactly what you wanted in a life-or-death dogfight. And the Germans, they laughed. They called it a milk jug, a brick with wings. One Luftwaffe pilot reportedly said, "It's so big, we won't need to aim." And truthfully, even American squadrons had doubts. They'd seen what the Bf-109 and Fw-190 could do. They knew those planes were fast, sharp, and already proven in combat. This new thing, it looked like it might get laughed out of the war. But the thing is, first impressions can lie, and the P-47 was full of surprises. Because what most people didn't see, not yet, was that this plane wasn't made to dance. It was made to crush. It was made to survive hits that would take other fighters out of the sky. To carry firepower most pilots had never seen before. To dive faster, hit harder, and take more damage than anything the Luftwaffe had ever gone up against. All of that was hidden beneath its strange shape. The P-47 didn't need to be beautiful. It just needed a chance to show what it could do. And once it did, everything changed. It didn't take long for the P-47 Thunderbolt to earn a nickname. The pilots saw it. Big, round, wide in the middle. They said it looked like a milk jug flying through the sky. And just like that, the Thunderbolt became the jug. At first, it wasn't a name of honor. It was a joke. They'd say things like, "You flying the jug today? Better bring a map if you plan to turn it. Or, if you run out of fuel, just land it in a field and call it a barn." It wasn't said with hate, just disbelief. Fighter pilots were used to sleek machines, fast, thin planes that looked like they belonged in a race. The Jug looked like it belonged in the kitchen. But the thing is, nicknames stick, and sometimes they grow into something else. As the months went on, the tone changed, the laughs started to fade, because the same pilots who joked about the Jug started coming home alive because of it. This plane could take punishment, a lot of it. It could fly through flak, bullets, and cannon fire, and still land. Some Jugs came back with half a wing missing. Others had holes in the fuselage the size of dinner plates, but they still flew. One pilot said, "The Jug could take more hits than any man should ask of a machine." And it wasn't just tough, it was powerful. Once pilots started to trust it, they realized something important. This wasn't a fragile bird. It was a sledgehammer. It wasn't built to twist and turn in tight circles. It was built to dive hard, hit fast, and punch holes through the enemy, then climb back to do it again. It wasn't pretty, but it was deadly. And slowly, the nickname Jug began to change. Now it wasn't just something funny, it was something feared. German pilots didn't call it a joke, they called it a problem, because every time they saw that big, round shape coming toward them, they knew what was coming, and if they didn't move fast enough, they weren't coming back. That's when the Jug became something more than a nickname. It became a warning. Not every war machine has to look sharp to be dangerous. Sometimes, the ugliest one in the sky is the last thing you ever see. So what made this flying Jug so dangerous? It all started with what was under the hood. The heart of the P-47 Thunderbolt was a monster. The Pratt & Whitney R280 Double Wasp. A name like that might not mean much at first, but trust me, the enemy felt it. This was a turbocharged 18-cylinder engine. It packed over 2,000 horsepower, and when you fired it up, it didn't purr. It roared. It wasn't just loud, it was angry, like the sky itself was clearing a path. Most German fighters at the time flew with engines half that size. They were built for speed and agility, but not for brute force. The Thunderbolt, it didn't care about finesse. Thanks to the R2800, it could dive at over 500 miles per hour without breaking apart. That was unheard of. Other planes couldn't handle it. Wings bent, fuselages shook. If they pushed too hard in a dive, they fell apart. But not the Jug. The faster it fell, the meaner it got. And that dive wasn't just for show. Pilots used it to strike like a hammer. They'd climb high, watch from above, then drop like a stone, guns blazing, tearing through whatever was below. And then, they'd shoot back up, out of reach, before the enemy even had time to react. German pilots weren't used to that. They were used to turning fights. They expected the enemy to dogfight them in circles. But the Thunderbolt didn't play that game. It had power, it had speed, and most of all, it had altitude. At high altitudes, the turbocharger gave the R280 an edge. While other engines gasped for air, the Jug kept breathing easy. That meant it could fly higher, strike faster, and do it again and again, with a full load of fuel, ammo, and armor. The Luftwaffe quickly learned, if a P-47 was diving on you, you probably wouldn't see it until it was too late. And if you did see it, you were already in trouble, because outrunning it? Almost impossible. Out-climbing it? Good luck out-damaging it? Not likely. The R280 didn't just give the Thunderbolt power, it gave it confidence. It gave pilots the feeling that they could go anywhere, fight anything, and come back alive. And in a war like that, power wasn't just about speed, it was about survival. If the Thunderbolt had one superpower, it wasn't just how fast it could dive, it was how much punishment it could take, and still come home. The P-47 wasn't just a fighter, it was a flying tank. Its cockpit was wrapped in armor plating, its glass was bulletproof, its fuel tanks were self-sealing, which meant even if they were hit, they could close themselves off and keep the plane flying. It was one of the first planes built with the idea that the pilot should survive everything, and sometimes it did. There are stories of Jugs limping back to base with parts of the wing missing, holes the size of basketballs punched through the fuselage, oil pouring out, flaps hanging loose, wheels refusing to come down, and somehow, they still landed. One pilot said, "I thought the plane was falling apart around me, but the engine kept going." Another came back with over 200 bullet holes, and didn't even realize it, until he got out of the cockpit. Some were so torn up that ground crews thought they'd been hit by bombs. But nope, just another Thunderbolt that refused to die. This toughness wasn't an accident, it was built that way on purpose. Republic Aviation knew that if you wanted pilots to fly into hell, you had to give them something that could bring them back out, and the Thunderbolt earned that trust. Pilots flew it with confidence. They knew they had a better chance of surviving in a jug than almost anything else in the sky, and that confidence made them braver. They flew lower, dove harder, took risks they wouldn't dare in other planes, because they believed in the machine beneath them. And when word spread, the enemy took notice too. German pilots started calling it the plane that wouldn't die, because you could shoot it, hit it, even tear pieces off of it, and it still kept coming. In the air war over Europe, that kind of toughness changed everything. It wasn't just about how many enemies you could shoot down, it was about how many missions you could survive. And the P-47, it gave those numbers a whole new meaning. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't elegant, but it was strong. Strong enough to fight, strong enough to return, strong enough to win. It wasn't just the engine, and it wasn't just the armor. What truly made the P-47 Thunderbolt terrifying was what happened when the pilot pulled the trigger. 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing, all aimed straight forward, all ready to rip through anything in their path. Most fighters carried 4 guns, some only 2, but the Thunderbolt, it brought 8. That meant more bullets, more firepower, more destruction in less time. Together, those 8 guns could fire up to 100 rounds per second. Think about that. Every second. A wall of lead so thick, so fast, so violent, it could tear through steel, rip wings clean off enemy planes, punch holes through tanks, shred trains, trucks, and bridges into scrap. And it didn't take much. 1 clean burst, 2, maybe 3 seconds. That was all it needed. If you were flying toward a P-47 in a head-on pass, you were gambling with your life. German pilots weren't used to that. Their tactics were built on agility. Get close, turn inside, strike fast. But against the jug, getting close was a mistake, because before they could line up a shot, they were already getting hit. Sometimes they didn't even know where the rounds were coming from. Just a flash, then silence, then falling. The Thunderbolt wasn't about fancy flying, it was about ending the fight fast. It could take down a fighter with a single burst. And later in the war, when it started flying ground attack missions, those same guns became a nightmare for German troops. They called them the buzzsaws. Soldiers on the ground said it felt like the sky was ripping open, because when a P-47 came in low, guns blazing, there was nowhere to hide. Convoys, tanks, trains, artillery positions, gone in seconds. It wasn't surgical, it wasn't clean, it was raw, brutal, overwhelming firepower. That's what the Thunderbolt was built for, to hit harder, faster, and leave nothing behind. And with 8.50 cal screaming from its wings, that's exactly what it did, time and time again. The jokes didn't last long, because once the Thunderbolt got into combat, everything changed. It started in the skies over France. At first, German pilots still thought it was a joke. They'd spot the jug from a distance, big, slow-looking, not much of a threat, easy target, they thought. But then it dove, and everything they believed vanished. The P-47 would drop from high above, screaming down like a falling star, that massive engine roaring, 8.50 caliber guns already lighting up, and in just a few seconds, a German fighter would vanish in smoke. This thing shouldn't be able to do that. That was the reaction from Luftwaffe pilots after their first real encounters. They expected it to struggle in the air, but it didn't. They expected it to fall apart under pressure, but it didn't. They expected it to lose, but it didn't. Instead, it dropped out of the sky like thunder, fired a burst that ripped their fighters to shreds, and then pulled back up before they could react. It was like trying to swat a hammer, too fast, too heavy, too late. One German pilot survived a head-on pass with a jug. His words, "I thought I had him lined up. Then my wing disappeared." It wasn't just speed, and it wasn't just firepower. It was how sudden the attack came, and how quickly the P-47 escaped afterward. It was hit and run in the sky, but with the force of a cannon. The Luftwaffe wasn't prepared for that. Their fighters, the Bf-109s and FW-190s, were fast and agile, yes, but they weren't built to take that kind of hit, and they weren't used to enemies diving from above with that much weight, speed, and firepower. In those early missions, something became clear. The P-47 didn't need to outturn them. It didn't need to dogfight them. It just needed to hit them once. And when it did, they were done. Word started to spread through the Luftwaffe ranks. Watch for the dive. Don't go head on. Stay low, or you'll be spotted. The fear had begun. Because once you saw that thick, round shape coming down from the clouds, you knew what was coming. And if you didn't move fast enough, you weren't going to move again. The Thunderbolt didn't fight. Like other planes, it didn't dance. It didn't weave through the sky in tight circles. It didn't try to outturn the enemy, because it didn't have to. The P-47 had a different plan, a new kind of tactic, something that would completely change how American pilots fought in the sky. They called it boom and zoom. It was simple and deadly. Climb high, wait, and then dive, fast, hard, straight at the enemy. As the jug dropped, its speed would shoot past 400, then 450, then over 500 miles per hour. At that speed, the German fighters couldn't touch it, couldn't turn fast enough, couldn't climb to meet it, and just as the jug got within range, the pilot pulled the trigger. 8.50 caliber machine guns lit up the air. One burst, 2 seconds, and it was over. Then, before the enemy could react, the jug pulled out of the dive and climbed back up into the sky. Gone. No turning, no chasing, no second chance. It was a strike, an escape. That was boom and zoom. And for the Thunderbolt, it was perfect. This tactic turned the jug's weaknesses into strengths. Yes, it was heavy. Yes, it was slower to turn, but it had raw power, and it could dive faster than anything else in the air. That power gave pilots the edge they needed. Before the P-47, most American fighters tried to dogfight the Germans, turn for turn, move for move. But the Luftwaffe had years of experience doing that. They knew every trick in the book. Now, with boom and zoom, the Americans wrote a new book. They didn't play the same game. They brought a sledgehammer to a fencing match. And it worked. One pilot described it like this: I'd get up high, spot a 109, drop like a rock, squeeze the trigger, and before he knew what hit him, I was already gone. This kind of attack shocked the Luftwaffe. They were used to quick, turning dogfights. Suddenly, they were getting blasted out of the sky by enemies they didn't even see coming. And when they did spot them, the jugs were already pulling away. The boom and zoom tactic changed everything. It gave American pilots confidence. It gave them kills. And more importantly, it gave them a way to survive. The P-47 wasn't just a big, tough fighter anymore. It was smart, it was strategic, and it was lethal. By late 1943, the sky didn't feel the same anymore. Something had shifted. The Luftwaffe, once feared, once unbeatable, was starting to lose control. And the P-47 Thunderbolt was right in the middle of it. What started as a plane nobody believed in was now becoming one of the most feared weapons in the air. Every week, more Thunderbolts filled the skies over Europe. Their numbers grew, their tactics sharpened, and their pilots became more aggressive. They didn't just fly missions anymore. They hunted. German formations would go up expecting a fight, but instead, they were met with shock and awe. Jugs came screaming down from high altitude, guns blazing, dive attacks so fast, so violent, that enemy pilots barely had time to react. 1 second they were flying, the next they were falling. It wasn't a fair fight anymore. And that's exactly how the Allies wanted it. This was more than dogfights now. It was air dominance. The Luftwaffe tried to respond. They changed formations. They flew in pairs. They adjusted tactics, but nothing seemed to work. Because the Thunderbolts were everywhere. And they weren't flying alone anymore. They flew in groups. They flew with bombers. They flew with purpose, day after day, mission after mission. The P-47s kept hitting hard. Factories, airfields, fuel depots, convoys. Nothing was safe. It was relentless, and for German pilots, it was exhausting. They couldn't rest. They couldn't prepare. Because every time they took off, there was a chance a jug was waiting. Even if they managed to shoot one down, more would come. And when the Thunderbolts came back with bullet holes and engine damage, they still landed, still rearmed, still flew again the next day. That's when the fear started to grow. Because how do you fight an enemy that keeps coming, that doesn't go away, that gets stronger the longer the war drags on? By the end of 1943, the air war had changed. The Germans weren't leading anymore. They were reacting, scrambling, losing ground. The P-47 wasn't just a fighter plane now. It was a symbol of momentum, of strength, of a turning tide. The Luftwaffe had ruled the skies for years, but now they were being pushed back, and the jug was leading the charge. The P-47 Thunderbolt didn't just change the way Americans fought. It changed the way the enemy flew. By 1944, the Luftwaffe knew they had a problem. Their old tactics, the ones that had crushed Allied air forces for years, just didn't work anymore. You couldn't meet a Jug head-on. You couldn't outdive it. And trying to outgun it, that was suicide. So the orders started to change. German pilots were told to avoid direct confrontations with the Thunderbolt. No more head-on attacks, no more turn-and-burn dogfights. Instead, they were told to strike from behind or below, quick ambushes, then run. Some Luftwaffe units even flew lower to the ground, just to stay off radar, hoping to catch P-47s by surprise before they could climb and return fire. But even then it didn't always work, because the Jug was built to take hits, and even when it did get hit, it still fought back. Pilots described getting jumped, taking fire, and still pulling up into a climb, just long enough to turn and unleash all 8.50 cals on the attacker. And sometimes that was all it took. The German air war was changing fast. They were no longer the hunters. They were the ones being hunted. And they knew it. Stories began to spread among Luftwaffe pilots about Thunderbolts taking unbelievable amounts of damage and still returning home, about convoys shredded by low-flying Jugs, about surprise attacks that failed because the P-47s turned around faster than anyone expected and brought hell with them. The fear was real. German flight manuals began listing avoidance tactics specifically for Thunderbolt encounters. Keep your altitude advantage. Attack in pairs. Strike only when you're certain. Then, disengage. In other words, don't take chances, because if the P-47 saw you first, you were already in trouble. This shift in strategy was more than just survival. It was a sign that even the best-trained pilots in the Luftwaffe no longer had the confidence to go toe-to-toe with the Americans, not because they weren't skilled, but because the Jug had changed the balance. It was faster in a dive, stronger in a fight, harder to kill, and everywhere. And when an enemy no longer wants to engage, you've already started to win. The Thunderbolt didn't just beat the Luftwaffe in the air, it forced them to play defense. And in a war like that, that's the beginning of the end. By 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had already made a name for itself in the skies. But now it was about to become even more dangerous, because it wasn't just fighting planes anymore. It was tearing up everything on the ground too. As the Allies pushed into France and beyond, the need for close air support exploded. Tanks, trains, convoys, bridges, all targets, all moving, all critical. The mission was simple: cripple the enemy before they ever reached the front lines, and the perfect weapon for that job was the Jug. The P-47's heavy frame could carry bombs, rockets, and a full load of ammo for its 8 machine guns, all at once. Other planes could drop 1 or 2 bombs. The Jug could bring the whole toolbox. It was no longer just a fighter, it was a flying hammer. Pilots would take off with 500-pound bombs under the wings, high-velocity rockets strapped alongside, and still have enough firepower left in the guns to flatten anything that moved. When the Jug came in low, the sound alone was terrifying. Ground troops described it like thunder rolling across the earth. Then a sudden scream of engines, a flash of silver overhead, and then everything exploded. Convoys were shredded. Columns of tanks were split open like tin cans. Trains derailed. Artillery positions vanished in fire and dust. There are stories of entire German units scattering into the woods at the sound of a P-47 overhead, not even firing back, just running, because they knew what was coming. It wasn't just one plane, one pass, one bomb. It was a storm. Pilots said they'd often fly multiple ground attack missions a day and still come home with enough damage to make ground crews shake their heads. They'd pull shrapnel out of the wings, patch up holes in the fuselage, reload the guns, and send the Jug right back up again. The Thunderbolt was tough enough to survive ground fire, fast enough to hit targets before anyone could react, and deadly enough to wipe out entire supply lines in a single pass. This shift in role changed the war on the ground. Suddenly, German forces couldn't move freely. A tank wasn't just vulnerable in battle, it was vulnerable everywhere. A road, dangerous, a bridge, could be gone in seconds. Even parking under trees wasn't safe, because once the Jug took to the skies, nowhere was safe. The Thunderbolt didn't just support ground troops, it cleared the path, and every soldier on the ground knew, if you heard the roar of a Jug above you, that was the sound of help, of safety, of overwhelming firepower coming to your side. And if you were on the wrong side, it was the sound of something worse, the sky falling on your head. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Thousands of Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy. It was one of the largest invasions in history, and it could have gone horribly wrong. But above the chaos was the Thunderbolt. The P-47 wasn't just flying that day, it was fighting, covering, protecting. And in the days and weeks that followed, it became one of the most important weapons the Allies had. Because once the troops got off the beach, the real fight began, pushing through hedgerows, small villages, and open fields filled with German armor and ambushes. And that's where the Jug came in, flying low, hitting hard, and striking fast. Thunderbolts would roar over the battlefield, spotting enemy tanks hiding behind walls or trees, and turn them into scrap in seconds. One pass, one burst of 8.50 cal machine guns, sometimes followed by bombs or rockets, and whatever was down there wasn't anymore. German tanks, once feared and respected, started backing off, not because they lost their power, but because the sky was no longer theirs. The P-47 made sure of that. It was like flying artillery, but more precise, more mobile, and always watching. Allied troops on the ground called it the Angel with Claws, because when they were pinned down or surrounded, one radio call could bring a Jug screaming in with guns blazing. It didn't just provide support, it turned the tide of individual battles. Convoys gone, fuel depots exploding, bridges gone before the enemy could use them. Even railroads and train lines were torn apart, cutting off German reinforcements and supplies when they needed them most. Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy, wouldn't have worked without the Thunderbolt. Pilots flew mission after mission, day after day, clearing the path for tanks, opening gaps in enemy lines, and making sure no German unit could move without being seen or destroyed. There's a reason they called it a flying artillery platform, because once it was in the air, the battlefield was never the same. And unlike many ground attack aircraft, the Jug could take damage, absorb flak, and still fly home. It didn't just deliver destruction, it survived it. German soldiers began to fear the sound. That deep, heavy engine, the scream of a dive, and then, the thunder. The P-47 wasn't just a plane, it was a message. From the air to the ground, you can't hide, you can't run, and the sky belongs to us now. You can measure a plane by numbers. Speed, firepower, armor. But to truly understand its legacy, you have to hear it from the people who flew it, and the ones who tried to survive it. For American pilots, the P-47 wasn't just a fighter, it was a lifeline. They didn't just respect it, they loved it. One U.S. pilot said, "She was big, she was heavy, but she brought me home more times than I deserved." Another called it the best damn plane a man could ask for in a fight. They talked about taking fire over enemy territory, losing oil pressure, hearing metal tear apart around them, and still landing safely. One pilot came back with his landing gear gone, half a wing shot off, and the engine coughing smoke. But he made it, because the Jug wouldn't quit. "I wouldn't trade the P-47 for anything," said another. "If I had to get hit, I'd want to be hit in that plane." It was more than a machine. It was a brother in battle. But while the Americans praised it, the Germans feared it. One Luftwaffe pilot, after facing the P-47 for the first time, said, "Unbeatable in a dive. We couldn't catch it, and we couldn't escape it." Another admitted, "We were told not to engage them directly. If you saw one diving, you turned and ran." That fear wasn't just from stories, it was from experience. German pilots learned quickly that trying to outturn a Jug was pointless. Trying to outrun it in a dive, even worse. It wasn't just the firepower, it was the shock. Pilots described the Jug's attacks as sudden, violent, and overwhelming. One moment they were flying in formation, the next, everything exploded. Ground troops weren't spared either. German infantry units called them Black Eagles, because when they flew overhead, they dropped death with terrifying precision. One captured soldier simply said, "You never forget the sound." The Jug made an impression on both sides, and that's rare. Usually, one side sees a plane as a tool, the other as a threat. But the Thunderbolt, it earned respect on both ends of the gun. It was a survivor's plane, a killer's machine, and a pilot's best friend. In a war where machines often broke before the men did, the P-47 was different. It stayed with you, protected you, fought for you. And if you were lucky, it brought you home. The Luftwaffe had two of the deadliest fighters of the war, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf FW 190, fast, agile, combat-tested. These were the planes that had dominated the skies for years. They danced in the air, turned on a dime, and chewed up Allied fighters with deadly precision. So how did the P-47 Thunderbolt compare? Let's break it down. In terms of speed, they were surprisingly close. The Bf-109 and Fw-190 could reach up to 400 to 420 miles per hour depending on the variant. The Thunderbolt, around 433 miles per hour, especially deadly in a dive. Thanks to its turbocharged R-280 engine, the Jug could hit those speeds at high altitude and hold them longer. Climb rate, the Germans had the edge. Their fighters could get up quickly, gain position, and drop into combat before most Allied fighters could react. But agility, no contest. The German planes were lighter, more maneuverable, and built for dogfighting. If you got into a turning fight with a Bf-109 or an Fw-190 in a Jug, you were in trouble. But here's where the game changes. Survivability. If the German fighters were race cars, the Thunderbolt was a bulldozer. The P-47 could take punishment, more than either German fighter could dream of. One burst of cannon fire could rip a 109 apart, but a Jug, it might fly through that burst and still make it home. And then there's firepower, 8.50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. No other single-engine fighter in the war brought that kind of consistent, brutal damage to every engagement. The Fw-190 carried 20mm cannons. The Bf-109 had its own teeth. But the Jug didn't rely on just one shot. It brought a storm, and that changed the fight, because while the German fighters had the edge in maneuvering, the P-47 didn't fight like that. It didn't need to. It would climb high, dive fast, unleash a brutal burst, then climb again before the enemy could even turn. Boom dash and dash zoom dot. Simple, deadly, effective. And it worked again, and again, and again. Luftwaffe pilots began to fear direct engagements, because if they couldn't kill the Jug instantly, it would kill them. The Thunderbolt wasn't perfect. It wasn't elegant. But in head-to-head real-world combat, it didn't need to be. Because the truth is, you don't have to be the best dancer in a knife fight. You just have to swing harder, and not go down. And that's what the Jug did, every single time. The P-47 Thunderbolt didn't just win fights in the sky, it won them in the factories. Because while Germany struggled to keep up with aircraft losses, America was just getting started. By the end of the war, the United States had produced over 15,000 Thunderbolts. 15,000. That's not just a number. That's a message. It meant that no matter how many planes the Luftwaffe shot down, more were coming, and not just more better. Each Jug that rolled off the line came loaded with power, armor, and firepower. Each one ready to fly into combat. Each one backed by a nation that had turned its entire industrial engine toward victory. This wasn't by accident. While Germany was splitting resources across multiple war fronts, America was pumping out planes, tanks, ships, and weapons at a pace the world had never seen. The Thunderbolt was the perfect example of that machine in motion. Factories across the U.S. ran day and night. Welders, engineers, mechanics, and laborers worked non-stop. The process was smooth, fast, and focused. Each P-47 that left the assembly line added pressure to the German war machine. Because the Luftwaffe couldn't keep up, their best fighters were limited in number. Every time they lost a pilot or a plane, it hurt. Every time a hangar was bombed, production slowed. But the Americans, they just built more. One German officer reportedly said, "We shoot down 10 of their planes, and they send 20 more the next day." That's not just frustration, that's fear. The Allies weren't just throwing bodies at the problem. They were sending high-quality, battle-tested machines in massive numbers, quantity with quality. That's the phrase historians use when they talk about the Thunderbolt. It had the firepower, it had the durability, and it had volume. That combination changed the air war, because no matter how good a German pilot was, eventually, he'd be outnumbered, outgunned, and overwhelmed. The Thunderbolt became more than a fighter. It became a symbol of American industry, of endless supply, of the idea that this war wasn't going to be won by skill alone, but by momentum, numbers, and will. And when 15,000 of these steel beasts filled the skies from France to Germany, there was no escape. The Luftwaffe wasn't just fighting pilots anymore. They were fighting factories, freight trains, and a nation that had decided, we're not losing at first. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a powerhouse in combat, but it had one major weakness: range. It could fight like a monster, but it couldn't go deep. That was a problem, because the US bombing strategy depended on long-range missions. B-17s and B-24s flying hundreds of miles into Nazi territory, and without fighter escort, those bombers were easy targets. The Luftwaffe knew it, and they waited. Thousands of Allied bomber crews paid the price, shut down over cities, forests, farmlands, too far from help. The sky became a graveyard, so something had to change, and it did. The solution: drop tanks, simple fuel containers strapped under the wings. Once empty, they'd be dropped, and the plane was free to fight. It was a small change, but it changed everything. Now, the Thunderbolt could fly deeper, much deeper. It could leave the coast of England, meet up with bomber formations, and stay with them all the way into enemy airspace. Then, when the Luftwaffe showed up, the jugs were ready, flying, high loaded with ammo, and protecting the bombers like guard dogs with wings. They dove into enemy formations, broke up attacks, and ripped enemy fighters out of the sky before they could even reach the bombers. The result: bomber losses dropped, morale rose, and German pilots were forced to fight a battle they could no longer control. The Thunderbolt didn't just protect planes, it protected lives. It gave bomber crews a chance to finish the mission and come home. One B-17 gunner said, "When we saw the jugs above us, we knew we had a chance. When we didn't, we said our prayers." This was a new kind of war in the air, a team effort, wings protecting wings. And though the P-51 Mustang would later take over as the primary long-range escort, the Jug was the one that paved the way. It proved that fighters could go the distance, that bombers didn't have to fly alone, and that no matter how far the mission, help could follow. The Thunderbolt's range might have once been its weakness, but thanks to American ingenuity and some extra fuel under the wings, it became one of its greatest strengths. From city raids to deep strikes across Germany, the Jug was there, loud, angry, and absolutely relentless. You can measure the power of a plane in numbers, speed, firepower, armor, but sometimes the real damage is done inside the mind. And when it came to the P-47 Thunderbolt, the psychological impact was massive. For Allied troops, the Jug wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol, a flying promise that they weren't alone. They'd watch it roar overhead, sometimes limping, smoking, trailing fire, but still flying, still coming home. Soldiers would cheer when they saw it land, riddled with bullet holes, missing chunks of metal, because that meant the pilot made it. The mission made it. The Thunderbolt became a legend not just because it killed, but because it refused to die. One ground crewman said, "You'd see Jugs coming looking like scrap metal, and the pilot would climb out, smiling." It gave the Americans hope. It gave them courage, because if that plane could survive hell and come back, maybe they could, too. Now flip the story. Imagine you're a German pilot in 1944. You've spent years dominating the sky. Your squadron has kills, experience, pride, and suddenly, it all changes. You take off. You spot an American fighter. You think it's slow, bulky, an easy win. Then it dives, and before you even react, it's firing. Your wingman disappears in a flash. You pull up, try to escape, but it's climbing after you. You score a hit, direct to the fuselage, and it just keeps flying. You report it later. Stunned, "I hit him. I know I hit him, but he didn't go down." That's what the Thunderbolt did to the enemy. It broke confidence. And as more German aces were shot down, morale inside the Luftwaffe began to crack. Pilots started avoiding direct fights. Strategies changed. Orders were updated. Don't engage unless you have the advantage. But what do you do when there is no advantage? When the enemy is faster in a dive, harder to kill, and shows up in greater numbers every day? One Luftwaffe commander asked a chilling question. How do you stop something that won't die? That fear spread from the skies down to the ground. German soldiers learned to fear the sound of a Jug overhead because they knew what came next. Tanks burning, trucks exploding, units scattering, and even if they shot back, even if they hit it, the Jug might still come round for another pass. That's not just air power, that's psychological warfare. And in a war of attrition, breaking the enemy's spirit was just as important as breaking their machines. The P-47 did both. The war ended. The skies grew quiet. The guns fell silent. But the P-47 Thunderbolt didn't disappear. It had done its job, more than anyone ever expected. And now, it had something more to offer, a legacy. Long after World War II, the Jug continued to fly, not just in the US, but across the globe. It served in the air forces of France, Brazil, Mexico, Turkey, and others. It trained new pilots, flew patrols, even fought in small conflicts around the world, still holding its own. Why? Because it worked. The same reasons it dominated in Europe: toughness, firepower, versatility, made it valuable even after the war. It wasn't just a one-purpose plane. It was a multi-role fighter, one of the best ever made: air-to-air, air-to-dash ground, escort missions, strike runs. It did them all, and decades later, people still remember. You'll find Thunderbolts in museums today, not behind velvet ropes, but restored with care, sitting proud. Some still fly. At airshows, crowds gather to watch them lift off again. Engines rumble, wings gleam in the sunlight, and for a moment, the sky remembers. It's not just about the machine, it's about what it stood for. The Jug was more than metal and guns. It was courage, it was sacrifice, it was power, used to protect, to defend, and to win. Pilots who flew it still tell stories with pride, and those who saw it in action, from the ground or from the enemy's cockpit, never forgot it. In a world that moves fast and forgets faster, the Thunderbolt earned something few machines ever do: respect. Respect from its pilots, respect from its mechanics, respect from its enemies, because it showed up when it mattered, and it didn't flinch. From the beaches of Normandy to the skies over Germany, from the factories in America to the far corners of the world, the Jug left its mark. It wasn't the prettiest, it wasn't the fastest, but it may have been the toughest, and in a war like that, tough was what you needed. Today, when we look back on World War II, we talk about strategy, we talk about leaders, we talk about victory, but behind all of that were the machines and the people who flew them, and among them, the P-47 Thunderbolt stands tall, big, loud, unstoppable, a legend of the sky. In the beginning, they laughed. They looked at the Jug's shape, thick, round, awkward, and called it names: flying milk bottle, bathtub with wings, too big to fight, too slow to survive. Even some American pilots had doubts. It didn't look like a killer. It looked like a joke. But war doesn't care about appearances, and neither did the Jug, because when the skies turned red and the bullets flew, it was that very shape, that bulk, that armor, that raw power, that saved lives, that won battles, that shattered enemy lines. It outlasted, and outgunned everything the Luftwaffe threw at it. It became the hammer that broke the German air force, the shield that protected thousands of bomber crews, the roar behind every Allied advance from Normandy to Berlin. And all the while, it carried the same 8.50 caliber machine guns, one for each punchline, one for each enemy that thought they had the upper hand. The joke, it didn't die. It became legend, because in the end, the Jug got the last laugh. And history, it's still echoing that sound. They called it a flying milk bottle. They mocked its size. Even American pilots weren't sure it belonged in the sky. But the P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't built for beauty, it was built for war. In this cinematic deep dive, we explore how the most underestimated fighter of World War II became a legend, outdiving, outgunning, and outlasting the very Luftwaffe aces who once laughed at it. From brutal head-on attacks to ground-shaking strike runs in Normandy, the Jug changed the air war forever.